Failover and standby. What are failover and standby? Basically, a standby database is a hot standby. It sits there, it takes information from the primary. It doesn't necessarily do anything useful. It can, if you want it to, makes it more complicated, but it automatically takes over. The concept and the idea behind it is that if your main production active database has a huge problem and your eBay, it basically passes the active connections to the standby database, and the standby database can take over the processing and the servicing of all your users within a few seconds. And that standby database could obviously be in place somewhere across the country or across the world, and if there's, say, an earthquake on the west coast, the machines on the east coast will take over. So how does a standby work? Very basically, it does work in a number of different ways, but a simple method is that archive logs are copied lock, stock and barrel per archive log across from production to standby, and then the archive logs are applied to the standby database automatically, in effect as a reverse redo log, if you like. It's very simple. There are other types of standby databases that can have redo log entries passed to the database entry by entry, and it starts to look a little bit more like replication than standby, but it depends how much of a time gap you want between production and standby. If you have really large redo log files, then your archive log files will be copied at the same size, so you could lose a lot of entries if you miss an archive log file that wasn't copied when your production database went down. Also, you could lose some data because the archive log is really big and the connection between the two databases goes nuts basically halfway through a copy, and you lose half the file. You can't have half a file, it's useless. So you could lose a lot of data. Standby databases require extra licensing with Oracle, so they can get quite expensive, but they are essential to maintaining uptime and are generally added in with an Oracle RAC environment, where the standby basically becomes a standby/failover Oracle RAC database. We'll get to Oracle RAC a little later. There is another type of standby called a logical standby, which will allow you to have read-write access to the standby database during the processing of information being passed from production to standby. It's more complicated. Also, that standby database can become more of an active database used for something like reporting, where users become reliant on that standby, and quite often standby databases can be used for production activities, where if you want to change something in a production environment, you just switch them over and you start working on the original production, then you switch them back if you need to. So you want to be careful using a standby for anything other than just the standby. Obviously, the more remote your standby environment is from your main production database, the bigger the distance, the more likely you will experience some data loss if you have an issue with your production database. The main point of a standby failover architecture is that it takes over automatically when your main database fails. You shouldn't necessarily use it for anything else. To find information on standby database architecture, I'm going into the Oracle manuals again, and I'm at the master book list again, and I'm going to simply type standby and hit return. And that's interesting, it doesn't find anything. It's quite well, what's happened is that Oracle has actually renamed standby to data guard. It is no longer called standby. It used to be called standby in Oracle 8 and Oracle 9. As of Oracle 10, it was called data guard, but it is a standby database. Data guard concepts and administration. Standby databases are actually very simple, regardless of the fancy names and all that kind of stuff. Just look at the introduction. If you just read through this, you'll understand more about how it works. Look at the diagrams. Don't worry about it too much. These diagrams are pretty good. They're much more detailed than mine. Obviously they're much better than mine, but they're much more detailed and you need to have a better understanding.